Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. My guest today is Eric Robertson, who was a family lawyer. Read into that divorce, read into that warring family, civil war within families, frequently, sadly, and has now become a family therapist in Austin, kind of drawing on that experience from the trenches of trying to resolve conflict rather than exacerbate conflict, and has now taken that into work specifically in the male domain. We've had a feminist movement over the last century, but we haven't really had any equivalent movement for males. And I think we're seeing the results of that in both my generation of males and the younger generations of males as well. There is a sort of disorientation, perhaps, I think is the easiest way to put it. So I'm really intrigued to have Eric come and give us his insights over a lifetime of working in the field of conflict resolution. So if you've been through a divorce, if you've gone through a divorce, if you're going through a divorce, listen up. If you are a male who feels, well, what's my place? How am I even relevant these days? Listen up. Eric has a lot to say on these things. So Eric, thank you for coming on. Can you just give us a bit of a bio on, who you are and how you've arrived at this point?
Well, I've made a circuitous route to where I am today. I started out years ago thinking I wanted to be a psychologist. I was in a graduate program working toward a PhD, and I was married at the time, and my wife got accepted to law school. So I took my master's in psychology at that point and moved with her to Austin, Texas, so she could go to law school. I used to hang around at the law school with her thinking, well, this is a pretty good gig. Maybe I ought to try this. So right after she finished, I went to law school. And from day one after I got my license, I started practicing divorce work and family law work, and did that for 33 years. And there was something about the conflict and everything that's going on in a divorce that at some point made me rethink where I was headed, and made me think about what had taken me into psychology in the first place. So I went back to school and got another master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and am now practicing as a licensed professional counselor associate in Austin, Texas, with a focus on doing work with men and some marriage and family counseling. Seeing how people act in divorces was really eye-opening to me. As you can imagine, and your listeners probably can imagine, men and women go through that process differently. And what I saw was pretty normal from my perspective with regards to women, but with men, they weren't doing a very good job going through it. They weren't expressing the emotion that women did at the process. And it really made me think about what's going on with men. And that kind of led to my interest in doing the kind of work that I do now with men. And I want to share with your listeners some facts that may surprise them, or they may not if they're going through this kind of process, or if I've lived some of this. But as anybody that's watched the news knows, boys and men are experiencing higher levels of loneliness and mental health risks than ever before. Some of these facts come from the American Institute of Boys and Men, but 15% of young men have recently reported not having a close friend. That's a 5-fold increase from what it was in 1990. Now, when I grew up and when you grew up, we probably had mates and friends that we were close to, and we developed friendships. That's not happening now. And there's a number of reasons we can talk about, but that doesn't happen. And the question is, why is that important as we look at what's going on with men? And the reason it's important is that men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And when I learned that, I thought that's a pretty astounding fact. In 2023, it was reported that 80% of suicides were men, and that men were far less likely to seek any kind of help for that than women are. And you think about that. So in 2023, it's reported that 39,000 men died from suicide in the US. Worldwide, that number was 535,000. That's an astounding number. And it shows what's going on in our society with men. Loneliness and isolation may seem sad to some people, but they're health risks. Young men often feel disconnected from their community and they have no emotional support, and that contributes to anxiety and depression and all sorts of other mental health issues. So, and I wanted to know, why is it that men don't get out there and get the help they need? And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Statistically, 67% of teenage boys between the ages of 15 and 17 reported struggling with something emotional, but didn't feel they needed any professional help. 70% didn't even know what a mental health professional was. So there's a lack of education in our society, in American society especially, about what to do when you're having mental health issues when it comes to men. We recognize that in women, but we don't recognize that in men. A lot of it's because men show up differently than women do when there's mental health issues. Societal messages play into that. The man up, men don't cry, work through it, just muscle through it. Those are the messages that I got growing up, and I suspect you did too, Rupert.
Yeah, I
and didn't help. Didn't help.
Why?
The other thing is,
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
The other thing is, it was surprising to me as I went into this new line of work, is that at least in this country, mental health professionals are overwhelmingly female dominated. Men make up a minority of the practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, counselors. I think something like 26% of mental health professionals currently are men. 26%. And I don't know about you, but the likelihood that I'm going to go in and lay out everything that's going bad in my life to another female is probably not attractive to a lot of men.
Yeah. Question. What is the reason why many of these men or younger men don't even know what a mental health professional is? That's surprising to me. Because it's so much a part of the conversation on social media. Social media is all about mental health, right?
Right.
Everyone talks about their mental health. Given that there's that exposure, how does that knowledge gap happen?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think traditionally men have been trained not to think about problems that they have that might require a mental health professional, so they don't learn about that sort of thing. I think that is changing. You're right. In social media, that's a big deal, and it's changing somewhat. But I think that the messages that go out in social media about mental health issues and where to find help for many, many years were oriented towards females. And as you mentioned earlier on, we've had a feminism movement that's been going on for a number of years, and I don't have anything bad to say about that. I think
it's a necessary thing, sure.
Yeah, it's a necessary thing. But men have been left behind. And so the messages often are oriented towards women.
Mm.
not towards men. And the other thing is as I'll point out a little bit later, the the issues that men have, although they may be the same as the issues that women have, they show up in a different way.
Can you elucidate on that a little bit? How do they show up differently?
Yeah. Yeah. The one of the things that I think people don't recognize is that there is a difference between men and women in terms of how they represent themselves when mental health issues come up. The one of the things that men tend to do is externalize their emotions, whereas women tend to internalize those. And for women, that shows up as the emotional outbursts and the psychological feelings of being extremely depressed and sad. Where for men, it shows up in a different way. Men show up the psychologically they show up as irritable. So they may show a lot of anger. They have a lot of emotional numbness or flatness. We've all heard men, especially boys, when you ask them what's wrong, they'll say, "Nothing. It's fine. I'm fine."
Yeah.
"How are you doing?" "Well, I'm doing okay," or "I'm angry." That's what you get from men. They tend to be withdrawn from their relationships and activities when they get depressed, rather than showing signs of depression. They turn that into overworking and maybe compulsive productivity and inability to rest. There's increased risk taking by men,
Okay.
which you don't
Yeah.
see in women.
I've definitely
Escapism,
been guilty of that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
escapism, all the gaming, the porn, the doom scrolling, isolation. Those are all things that manifest for men, and that's much different than with women.
Do you not
Um,
feel that women also, though? I mean, I've known women who've been going through mental health struggles who've absolutely been extremely irritable and who have also used those same escapist tactics, the exact same ones you described.
right.
So, what is the difference? Because I do think one could say the same about both genders there.
Well, I think you could, and I think that with the advent of social media and artificial intelligence and
Hmm.
everything that's happening to us digitally, that perhaps those behaviors are moving closer together. Generally and historically, I think that men have responded differently. And, I use depression as a good example. With women, usually you get persistent sadness or tearfulness.
Hmm.
You have excessive worry or rumination. They show signs of guilt and worthlessness and self-blame, fear of abandonment.
Hmm.
Those are not how men exhibit their depression generally. They generally exhibit that in a different way.
How,
You know,
how do
they
that? How do men normally exhibit it? Would you say?
well, they exhibit it with increased conflict with their partners and families, emotional distance or checking out, difficult tolerating perceived criticism, feeling misunderstood but unable to explain why they feel that way.
Mm.
They talk about being a burden. They start giving away possessions when it gets to an extreme. They manifest it in physical symptoms like headaches, stomach problems, chronic pain, sleep problems, fatigue, that sort of thing.
Mm.
Women are it's more externalized, and with women, it's more internalized.
Mm. Mm. But you say that the suicide figures are higher for men at this stage?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting. So yeah, because I'm just thinking if I was perhaps not male listening to this, thinking, well, hold on, I mean, both genders go through all this kind of thing. Okay, it's we should, yes, perhaps, help men out more. But I think it's good to bring it down to a bottom line. If more men are killing themselves, then clearly we've got a problem. Are more men killing themselves than they used to? That's the next thing. And do
Yeah.
we have any
Yeah.
statistics to back that up that you know of?
I'm sure they're out there. I don't know of those. I've kind of focused on the current state of men's lives right now. I think
Mm,
there's always probably been a skew towards more suicides in men than women,
mm.
but that's something that would be
Because it's
interesting
so interesting.
to
I know
learn.
so many people who've made suicide attempts, but when I think about who they are, they're almost all female.
Yeah,
The suicides that I know of that did it, just doing a little check here. I do think, yeah, I think most of them were men. It's true. And what's interesting too is that some of them were men who were outwardly quite successful. You know,
hmm
it wasn't that they were necessarily lost boys in their mum's basement gaming. They were men who one thought, well, hold on, you know, successful life, ticked most of the boxes. In your therapy, so in both your family law practice and your now in your therapy practice, you must have come across many of these types of men. The fact that someone could even afford a divorce lawyer means that they've reached an economic bracket where that's even possible, right? Lawyers are
sure.
not cheap. And then now that you're a therapist, you're kind of presumably often dealing with the same demographic. Why are successful men so messed up?
I think they're a product of their own success in some respects. I think one of the things you have to look at is what got them to that point. What drove them to be successful? What is it about their upbringing, their childhood, their life in general that pushes them and drives them towards that success? What is it that they're in their life that they're trying to fill? And oftentimes, what you see is that these men succeed and they become successful, but they're not filling that hole. They're not getting what they're really looking for, whether that's validation from people that are important to them or whatever it is. And
Is that a thing that really comes up a lot? Validation from people that are important to them.
yes, yeah,
Talk
it
to me
is.
about that. Talk that
Yeah.
that that that's not something I think we should just let go in passing.
No,
What's
I think that,
expressed?
I'm sorry.
What are they expressing when they say that? And
They,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, they're expressing that they're doing all this, and sometimes it's misplaced, but they're doing all this, and the people that are important to them aren't showing them the validation that they think they deserve.
right,
And oftentimes the people around them aren't doing that because this person is working 24 hours a day almost to succeed, and they are letting their significant relationships fall apart. They're not spending the time necessary to maintain those relationships or to grow those relationships. And so they interpret that when people, their spouse or their family or their friends, don't spend a lot of time throwing admiration at them as a lack of validation, when in fact, they're probably too busy to receive it most of the time.
have you suffered from any of this yourself? Would you say?
I think there was a time when that I had those feelings as well, when I was at the height of my career as a lawyer. And, success is a tricky thing. You can get to the point when you're successful that you start to believe, if you'll pardon the expression, your own bullshit.
Mm.
And I think that had some negative impacts on my relationship with my wife at that point and on how I related to my daughter. So yeah,
What would you
absolutely.
say in your own life? Could you put a number of years on that period? And at what point did you then notice?
I
And
think,
then from noticing to doing something?
yeah, yeah. No, I think that there was probably a period of about 10 years when I was at the height of what I would say was a successful career as a divorce lawyer.
Mm.
And I was more focused on maintaining that image than really spending time outside of my work environment, listening to what's going on with my wife and what's going on with my daughter. And I think that wasn't until maybe about 5 years ago when I started thinking seriously about making a change in careers that it really hit me. And I think that was one of the reasons
Why did
why I
it hit
made that
you? Like,
change.
how was it that you noticed? Why did you think
I
actually?
had a,
Like, no.
yeah, I had a kind of a dissatisfaction with what I was doing.
Mm,
As you know, I see clients I was seeing clients all day long and was dealing with not only my client, but the attorneys on the other side. And I started personalizing what was happening in my cases, which is a very
mm,
dangerous thing for a lawyer to do. You know, I like my clients. I always like my clients, but you have to keep a distance between what you're doing for your client and your relationship with your client.
mm.
And I started taking every accusation that came across from the other attorney personally. Not
And you
only are
hadn't done
you,
that before.
pardon?
And you hadn't done that before
I
earlier in your
hadn't done
career.
that before. No, for the
Why did it
first,
creep up on you?
I don't know. For the first 15 years, it was just learning the process of being a good lawyer and going into court and doing my thing and doing it almost rote by memory. You just had
Mm,
this muscle memory of what to do in a case and how to do it. And it was not uncommon for me to get bad things from other attorneys about my clients, and I would just kind of shuffle those off and not think about it. But there was a point where I really started taking that personally. And it was almost like the accusation they're making against my client was a personal reflection of me.
I wonder why that became that way. If you could, because I should imagine that there must be a lot of men, and we're talking about men at this point in middle age, and I think we should, after this, we should begin to talk about the younger generation too. But just staying where we are for a moment. So the majority of your clients would have been men in middle age, and women. Do you think there's something in that age bracket that brought you to this point where suddenly it was personalized? Suddenly you were taking it like a personal attack. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. I was in this mindset that I was going to be one of the best divorce lawyers in Austin, Texas, if not the state of Texas. And I got myself involved in not only state organizations that supported that mindset, but national organizations. I mean, I got to be a member of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, which is this group of less than 2,000 of the best family law lawyers in the United States.
Mm.
And I got to be on the board for the Texas chapter of that, and the president of that, and all that kind of stuff was going to my head. And I'm thinking,
Status. Yeah.
gosh, I'm at some level one of the best. And again, you start believing that stuff, and it drives your
Mm,
life. And you think, okay, what's the next thing I can do to make it even better, to
mm.
show even more success at my chosen career. And it takes a hold of you.
Do you think, though, that relationships are always more than one person? So, do you think that also your wife and your daughter played into that to some degree? Were their expectations on you, was love to some degree conditional to you showing up as this sort of, millionaire provider? Or did you just perceive that it might be? Or was there even some truth to that? Were you all
Yeah.
playing into that to some degree?
No, I really don't. I think I was to use a much overused term. I was caught up in my own narcissism at some level.
Okay.
And
It's so interesting that you say that because I've known you for some years, and I think narcissist is the last word I would use to describe you.
yeah. Well, I think you came along at a time when I had decided that all of that wasn't really what I wanted. And of course, the other thing that really helped me was I had a good mentor. You've met him.
I do know him. Yeah.
And he was always there reminding me that this is not who you are, this is what you do. And there are other things in life that are more important than, than
Talk
being the
talk to
best.
us a little bit about Tom, because I think one of the things I'd like to go to in this is mentorship. I think mentorship is something that every human needs, like we need oxygen. And I think particularly for men, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. Talk to us about this mentor.
Yeah, yeah. So when I started practicing family law, I practiced with my wife. She was a lawyer at the time. We practiced together for about 7 years. And we had an opportunity to go to work for another family lawyer in Austin, Texas, who had made us the offer. He was pretty well known as well, been around for a number of years, and said, look, you guys come to work for me. I got all these cases coming in. You work them, and I'll take a percentage of it. And I had just tried a case against Tom in a court just up the road, and he kicked my butt pretty well. And so, to her credit, my wife said, before we even think about this offer from this other attorney, why don't you ask Tom about that and ask him about this guy and if this is somebody that we want to essentially join forces with? And so I did. And as gracious as he is, he came and picked me up at my office when I called him and took me to lunch. And I asked questions about this other lawyer, and he answered them honestly. And then he drove me back. And when he dropped me off, he said, before you respond to this lawyer, I want you to think about it for 48 hours. Don't rush in there and pick up the phone and say yes or no or whatever. Just think about it. And I did. And less than 24 hours later, he called me back and said, I want to offer you a job to come over and work with me and my other partner at that time. He had one other partner. And Tom practiced law with that partner and his daughter. And so, I talked to my wife about that, and we decided that's what I wanted to do. And it was because he was an incredible gentleman in the way he dealt with people, including people on the other side of cases. I tried a case against him that one I mentioned. It was very contentious. I had a very bad client, and he was incredibly gracious to me through that whole process. He was able to make the distinction between my terrible client and the lawyer who was representing him. And that, when I came over and started working with him, it was just like stepping into another world. Everything didn't have to be adversarial. He mentored me on how to deal with difficult attorneys on the other side, how to deal with difficult clients, how to deal with difficult judges. And that was probably the reason I rose to the level I did in family law practice, because of his mentoring.
I think specifically what you're talking about here is conflict resolution, right? And
Right.
we're so used to thinking of particularly divorces as de facto conflict escalations. A couple of questions. First question, what makes a terrible client? You said I had a terrible client. Is a terrible client someone who's going in wanting conflict? Is it and that is that kind of what makes a terrible client?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you what for me made a terrible client early on in my career and how that's changed. A terrible client early on for me was one that was not open to taking advice, that did things just the opposite of how I advised them to do them, that created bad facts all along the way, including during their divorce. They would continue to behave poorly during the divorce, even though you'd sit down and explain to them that this isn't going to come out very well if you continue doing the kind of behavior you're doing. Usually a bad client is just one that doesn't listen.
Okay. But that has to come from, like, you then have to ask the question, why doesn't that person listen, right? If they hired you, they're spending all this money on you, they know deep down that you're trying to act in their best interest.
Right.
So therefore, if they're not following your advice on a kind of pathological level, not perhaps on an impulsive, angry in that moment, passionate, expression of pain thing, but consistently, then surely does that not mean that what they're after is conflict?
It
And what-
could. It could.
Okay.
Yeah. And, I recently wrote an article about why revenge wasn't a good strategy for a divorce.
Mm.
And,
Why isn't it? Tell us.
well, it's because it never comes out the way you think it's going to come out. You're never going to get it, number one. And secondly, at the end of the day, you're going to pour all these resources into trying to get that revenge. You're not going to get it. And you're going to look back at what she did and feel incredibly stupid for doing it. And so, but those clients are out there.
Yeah.
And the choice is you can continue representing those clients and continue to give them good advice and continue to try to get them to focus on resolving their case rather than going to war to see what happens. Or you can terminate your relationship with them and let them move on to somebody else who will
Have you
take
done
their
that?
money, and do what they want them to do. Oh yeah. One of the things that my mentor told me early on was firing a client is never a bad thing. If you get to the point where you can't communicate with that client effectively and they won't do what's in their best interest, that's not only good for them, it's good for you that they move on somewhere else.
I don't know if it's Confucius or if it's just an old Chinese proverb, but it's the one that says, when you begin a journey of revenge, dig two graves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And cycles of feud are so interesting because, as you know, I've spent some years living with Khoisan Bushman hunter-gatherer peoples in Southern Africa. So I've been lucky enough to see what the blueprint of human society is. These are the oldest societies on the planet. They predate agriculture, they predate ownership of things, other than a few personal items. And they are a very good advertisement for our species because the entire culture is based around conflict resolution. And it really comes to a very practical thing, which is that if you are living out there in Africa with a spear and your family, you are not the top of the food chain. You are mid-level. And the only thing that will put you on the top of the food chain is a community with whom you can communicate and strategize. So if conflict within the community, and it will happen, gets beyond a certain point and the community fragments, then every single person will be eaten by hyenas without a shadow of a doubt. So over about 300,000 years, which seems to be about as old as this culture is, and we all from other ethnic groups share DNA, an old common DNA with this group of people that goes back to a female actually living in what's now Botswana 60,000 years ago, which is still relatively recent by the standards of this culture. About every 10 days, they have a shamanic ceremony where it's kind of like the psychic dirty laundry of the group gets a chance to be washed so that conflict just doesn't get beyond a certain point. And they're really good at this. And this is the entire focus. As soon as agriculture came in, everything went the exact opposite direction. So I think a lot of us feel were sold a bill of goods growing up that about human nature. And we were all told that human nature is grasping and selfish and I want mine and look at the conquest of the American West and look at England's colonial past and look at Rome and it's all there in front of you. And while those things are true, they're not the whole truth. And I do think that everybody deep down actually wants to resolve conflict. Everybody deep down knows that it goes nowhere,
Yeah.
but they just can't get off that bandwagon. You
Yeah.
know? And when you were a lawyer, I guess you were trying to advise people to not climb onto that bandwagon, not burn the house down. I've heard you say it's a great term, like resolve this without destroying everything. But now you've moved into the therapy sphere, presumably people are coming to you specifically for conflict resolution, or do you see the same cycles repeated where people are coming in and they're wanting affirmation from you for conflicts that they're involved in, and they're sort of wanting validation in that? How's your experience with this?
Well, yeah, a little bit of both. People still come in initially with ideas of what they want. The therapist's role isn't to tell people what to do to make things better. The therapist's role, in
Damn it,
my
I was
view,
hoping you were going to do that today.
the therapist's role is to try to get people to understand who they are and how they can resolve and come up with the strategies to resolve their own mental health issues. So, yeah, I I do work with people going through divorces, and they're mad and angry,
Mm,
and they don't like what's happening to them. They don't like what they're going to have to give up to try to settle their case, and we talk about that. But what we're talking about in the therapy context is a little bit different than what I used to talk about in the divorce lawyer context. In the therapy context, we're talking about those emotions. I'm validating those emotions and letting them know that it's okay to feel that way, and trying to get them to understand that they have choices. They can continue to be that way, or they can move into some other arena. That's similar to some of the things that I did as a divorce lawyer. But from a divorce lawyer standpoint, I was a little bit freer to say things like, I don't think you want to do that.
mm,
And here's why. If you
mm,
do that, the other side's going to do this, and you're going to get really pissed off.
mm.
And if we get to the courthouse and we have to have a trial in front of a judge, they're going to be really pissed off, and you're going to feel the brunt of that, and you're going to come out on the losing end of that stick. So don't do it. And a
Now
therapy,
that's really helpful. Is that
yeah,
not by its definition conflict resolution right there?
it is. It's part of what I would put in the umbrella of conflict resolution. But from a therapeutic standpoint, that's not what a therapist would do.
Yeah. Do you
Now,
not?
again, some of the other things, some of the other stuff I do is, as we've talked about, is divorce coaching, which
Okay.
is helping people when they're in the midst of the divorce, to provide them support as they're going through the divorce, and to try to get them regulated if they're dysregulated emotionally, so that they can make good decisions, and so that they can listen to what their divorce lawyer is telling them and follow their divorce lawyer's legal advice. See, that's the difference between being a divorce coach and being a lawyer. Is the lawyer gives legal advice and gives you a legal strategy and does all these things that the law requires. As a divorce coach, I'm there to kind of support them and help them understand that this person that you're paying large amounts of money to help you through this divorce is giving you, for the most part, good advice. And we need to understand why you're reluctant to take it. What is it that's keeping you from doing what your divorce lawyer is telling you to do? And I'm not really a therapist in that role,
Yeah.
100%, but I'm
It's a
not,
great
I'm not,
hybrid role, I think.
yeah,
It's a really needed one because I think you can really help people to not destroy their families
yeah,
and
yeah.
themselves. As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal. working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called movement method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored as I was by Dr. Grandin and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online movement method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens. What are your strategies? Do you have like a go-to, like, I presume you must see patterns in clients, like personality type 1, personality type 2, personality type 3. Just over the years, these things must have, there's always patterns, to everything. And then do you have strategy patterns? And I'm just thinking if someone is watching this and listening to it, they might recognize themselves in one of those, and might be able to draw some really useful insights from that. And now as they're listening to, and then just before we go there to these patterns and how you approach them, is the divorce coaching thing quite a recent phenomenon? Because it's not something I've heard of before, but it does sound something very useful.
Yeah, it's fairly recent phenomenon. I'd say within the last 5 to 8 years. There's not a lot of people out there that do divorce coaching. There are some. Fortunately, there's a lot of people that got into divorce coaching after they went through a bad divorce themselves, which is probably not the person you need to choose to do that. But there are also hybrid therapies that kind of work along with things like divorce coaching. There's a concept called divorce discernment counseling, where couples who are having difficulty, who aren't wanting to go into marriage counseling, go into divorce discernment counseling for a number of sessions, a finite number of sessions, to determine whether or not they want to get a divorce or not. And I think when you talk about conflict resolution, that's one of the first places a lot of people might think to start. In terms of divorce coaching, I don't know that I have any set strategies. I mean, obviously, as you know, every case is different. Every person that comes in the office is different, presents different issues. My mode of working with people is the first session, we'll spend an hour to an hour and a half talking about their divorce. Normally, they're already in the divorce, and what got them there, what the issues are in their divorce, what the struggles are that they're going through in the legal process, and then we address each of those in the subsequent sessions. And oftentimes the first session is somebody coming in and just laying out every bad thing that's happened to them in the process leading up to the divorce and during the divorce, and how awful the other side is, and this is what I want to have happen. And then we have to talk about, well, what kind of advice are you getting from your attorney? Are you following that advice? Why not, if you're not? And one of the things I found over the years practicing law as a divorce lawyer was every client that came into the room had 5 or 6 shadow advisors that were feeding stuff to them about what they ought to do and what they shouldn't do in their divorce. And so when that comes into the room in a divorce coaching situation, we have to unpack that, and we have to talk about that. Who's giving you advice? Where did you get that? Who told you that? Why do you think that's important for you to do? And then we have to really examine that in the context of what is best for you as you go through your divorce. Do you really think that you ought to be listening to your sister or to your best friend give you advice about your divorce? And most of the time people come around to the idea that, well, as I was fond of saying when I was a lawyer, you're paying me $600 an hour for my advice and you're not taking it. Is that really a smart thing to do?
Yeah. I've got a question for you, which I just wrote down here. So why is it's counterintuitive? Why is someone who went through a bad divorce perhaps not a good divorce coach? Because let's say you're in AA, you would want your sponsor to be an alcoholic, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So if they haven't gone through it, what resources have they got
sure,
really to offer
sure.
you?
Yeah. I just wrote an article about that was posted on somebody's LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share with you to share with your
Mm,
listeners. But I'm not saying you can never hire somebody that's been through a divorce to be your divorce coach. What I'm saying is you need to be careful. People that go through a bad divorce come into the process with a bias. They're already pissed off at the process, or pissed off at their ex-spouse. They're mad and angry sometimes at their attorney or the judge. And so they come in with their own agenda. And a lot of times they're projecting their own stuff onto your case. And the advice you're going to get may not be the advice that you need from somebody that doesn't have that kind of emotional baggage. So you need to be very careful when you choose a divorce coach. And if somebody says on their website or in their materials that they've been through a divorce, you need to ask them some strong questions about, well, how did that go for you? Ideally, if you hire somebody like that, you'd find somebody that went through some sort of a collaborative process where they had very little conflict and they resolve things amiably, and they're just there to help other people learn those techniques and go through the divorce the same way. You don't want somebody that the first thing they tell you after you ask them about their divorce was, well, my spouse was a real no good
sure,
SOB, and
sure.
I got taken to the cleaners and the judge gave her everything. And
Yeah.
that's an
No, sure. That
indication.
that that
Yeah.
I could see, but I could see someone of real value saying, "Well, no, I had a terrible divorce,
Yeah.
and but during this, I tried to make it as as unterrible as possible, and tried to listen to my lawyer in this way, and tried to resolve the conflict,
Yeah.
as we best we could, and got did the best we could with the situation. That would reassure me.
Or somebody that recognizes that I went through a bad divorce and I behaved poorly and I
Right.
didn't follow my lawyer's advice and I came out of it badly, but it was my
Don't
own
do what I
fault.
did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, that would make sense. So, okay, let's go back to the your therapy hat. I think men from our generation, it's pretty clear, what the issues are. We were brought up brutalized. I know, I went to a certain type of military school in the UK where physical violence and assault was daily, and but from every level, from the teachers, from the other boys, from the older boys to the younger boys, and it was all encouraged, and it was, actively the culture, because it was supposed to make you tough. And what it did was it created all sorts of dysfunctions naturally, but its purpose was clear. It was supposed to be preparing boys to go out and run the British Empire, even though the British Empire didn't actually exist anymore. And although you could argue it became a bank, and a lot of my friends went into the armed forces or into banking. And the point was that it was going to produce an officer class of young men who would go out and like run a portion of the Sudan, possibly die at the age of 32 of malaria or killed in a tribal conflict, and sort of be able to do that with a kind of a confidence and a belief in themselves and a certain willingness to die. And we were told we're going to break you down to build you up. And they certainly did break us down. And what we were recomposited as was a motley collection of stuff. But I think that the stuff facing younger men today, and I'm the father of a 25-year-old, it's different. It's about, as you said earlier in the conversation, about anxiety, it's about loneliness, it's about isolation. And I think this is something I'd ask the readers and the viewers and the listeners to consider. If you're, do you know, are you this parent, or do you know someone who is this parent that they have perhaps two girls and a boy of young adult age, and of the two girls, one is at college, one is beginning her career, doing quite well, and the boy, who's a young adult, is in the basement and won't get off the computer game. Is this a familiar scenario?
Mhm.
I would posit that quite a few hands would go up.
Yeah.
Give us your thoughts on this.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. Number one, I don't think that what you've explained about your growing up, and to some extent the way I grew up in the United States, is completely gone yet. I think that there's
Fair
still
enough.
these traditional norms of masculinity that we teach boys early on, and things like strength and equal self-reliance, and we need to be in control with our emotions. We frame vulnerability as often as weakness or dependency or
Mm-hmm.
some sort of failure, which it isn't. And so I don't think that those things are all gone. I do,
100%.
yeah, I
Yeah.
do agree that there's this new thing that's come in that's allowed boys to try to escape from the world, the video game stuff and social media, and everybody's got a cell phone, and of course the kind of bullying that goes on social media with kids is horrendous. And I think that drives a lot of young men into the basement with the video game. That's where they can get away. They can get on these
Mm.
action games online and present whatever they think their view of masculinity ought to be in that
Mm.
context. And they're doing that on their own. There's no, even though you might be in one of these games where you're engaged with other people online, there's no emotional connection with those people. There's no friendship.
Mm.
You're not out there with your best buddy talking about how bad things are at home, or what's going on at school. You're
Or
stuck
sharing a goofy laugh. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
sharing a goofy laugh with somebody. That's not happening. And I think that's problematic. And I think, for us to turn that around, I think the most important step for parents, and I would put this out to your listeners, is to start early developing some sort of an emotional literacy with your boys. This means helping them name emotions other than "it's fine" or "I'm mad" or "I'm tired,"
Yeah.
and doing so without shaming them. That's
Yeah.
the other part. Adults should model that emotional language and normalize all the emotions that your boys especially, carry, and not try to assign that as being some sort of a weakness.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
One of the phrases I like is focus with boys, especially focus on connection before correction when they act out. Okay. Because
Mm.
I think in my growing up, if I did something wrong as a kid, I got the belt. Okay.
Yeah.
That dates me a little bit, but that fits in with the violence that you talked about.
Yeah.
And when they act out, there's a natural tendency to want to scream and shout and correct the behavior. But we need to understand what's going on first. And that's where the connection comes in.
You talked about mentorship. I think, I know, I observe that weirdly, this is getting harder and harder to find, it seems. And because we've had a feminist movement, I'm wondering if it's easier for females to find female to female mentoring, particularly intergenerational.
Yeah.
The elders, Why don't we have that for boys? Is it because men are working too hard, they're too checked out, they're not available, they're not there? Why
Yeah.
is it?
I think that's part of it. I think men of childbearing age now are real involved with their careers and with other things and not necessarily available to mentor.
Because it seems to me there's been a double standard, which is that, I mean, we humans are great at double standards, and I've produced many double standards myself. But the double standard is that as a male now, you're supposed to be available, vulnerable, communicative, compassionate, and absolutely, equal, work an equal thing between the genders and so on. However, at the same time, you're actually still supposed to be the breadwinner, and you're judged if you're not by females as much as by other men.
It's
And
funny you should say that.
yeah,
That is something I experienced as a divorce lawyer. So we're all familiar with this in the United States with the concept of the stay-at-home mom. She's a
mm,
mom that stays at home. She takes care of the household. She raises the kids. She does everything in the household.
and we honor
And
that. Yeah, yeah.
we want her there. And I'll throw this out to feminism. And she's not appreciated as much as she ought to be, perhaps.
Mm.
But every once in a while, I would get a case where those roles were reversed. And the female was the high wage earner, and they had made an agreement that the male would stay home and be the house husband and raise the kids. And the funny thing that happened with that is, in the context of the divorce, that female acted just like men act in the reverse situation. They took on the same traits as men. They resented the fact that this person stayed at home and didn't do anything, even though they were at home doing things. They resented the fact that they had gone out and earned all this money and now were having to split it with this person who stayed at home. And even though they made that agreement 7 years into it, when that she didn't like it anymore, the female would have the same complaints that men had in the same situation. So what that told me was, in those circumstances, there really isn't much of a difference in how men and women respond in those circumstances, although societally, I think they're more open to it now. There was a tendency to think that men that were staying at home doing that kind of stuff were kind of freeloading and not really living up to their potential. And of course, like I said, I think that's changing. But it always interested me that there was really, when you're in the thick of the conflict, the same things you hear from men, you'd hear from women.
Right, and that's a good insight, that it's more a human thing than a gender thing. But that also, I think the gender roles that and expectations that we're all brought up with can backfire, I think, to some degree on males, because yes, you are still expected to behave in that stoic manner. You're still supposed to be more the strong silent type. You're still supposed to go out and earn, and provide. And one of the difficulties about that is that, and that's why I asked you questions earlier in this conversation about whether there had been some of those expectations on you, because, or whether they'd been projections, because I think the reality is that for a lot of men, those expectations are still there. And what that does is it means that they can't actually be that available to their kids, because the time that it takes and the energy that it takes to be that sort of stoic breadwinner, unfortunately, does take time away from where they could be, available
Mhm.
to their spouses and children. How does one resolve this?
It comes down to making a choice about what's important to you.
Mm,
Well, what you have to examine your own values in terms of having a family and having children and having boys, and what you're willing to do to make sure that you raise best possible young man you can with the best possible emotional health that you can instill in them.
Mm,
And, that's a different thing because I like to think of, as you put it, how man has developed over history. And we've moved from what you described with the Bushmen to an agrarian to society. And now I'm going to get a lot of flack for saying this, but now we're a society, a world society driven by greed. Okay. That's the focus. The focus of life is making as much money and accumulating as much stuff as possible. Now, there's always exceptions to that, and there's a lot of people out there that don't live that kind of life. But if you look at the news in the United States, that's what you see all the time. That's a measure of success. And
hmm
as we talked about earlier, the way to get to that success is to work as hard as you can, as much as you can, and, there's 24 hours in a day. If you assume that you're asleep for 8 of it, you don't have a lot left
Exactly.
to work and then to devote to mentorship of your children or other people's children for that matter. And so that's I think that's a problem. And I don't think there's an easy way to turn that around if you're not willing to make the choice. Now, one of the other things that I think is really interesting is, and I'm sure you know this, but fewer and fewer people are getting married today and having kids. In many countries, including the United States, the birth rate is down. And if you talk to people that are living together, or even some that do get married, they have no interest in having children. And that's a whole different issue. But I think we would, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll be having a completely different conversation about this because we'll have screwed up this generation and there may not be another generation.
What
Or
conversation will we be having?
I think we'll be having a conversation about why people don't want to procreate, why they don't want to have a son or a daughter, why they don't want to have children. What
Why?
is it?
Why do you think it is? Why do you think people don't?
Well, I think I'll go back to the greed thing. I think a lot of it has to do with in Austin, Texas, I will tell you a lot of it has to do with it's so expensive to live here.
Mm, mm,
And that the idea that I can barely afford to live with this partner that I have, let alone bring another person into the world and have to cover the expenses of that, for a
mm.
lot of people is really daunting. Plus, I think that some of the things we've talked about how young people, young men in particular, are pulling away from connection with other people is going to lead to some of that. You know, as I was going through the my last master's degree program, I did an internship at the University of Texas seeing college kids. And I got to tell you, it was a little bit depressing what comes into the room with college kids these days.
Tell
Uh,
me.
they have difficulty, again, all these same things. They have difficulty making connection. Even those that want it don't know how to go out there and do it, and how to connect with other people, how to find other people. There is probably twice as many women on college campuses now than men. And so the dating pool for men may be big, but if you do the math on it, there's not a girl for every boy on campus. And so there's a lot of things that and even in college after COVID, when people were all kind of taken away from having any community
Mm.
to being online, a lot of those people started in high school and then transitioned into college during that period of time. They completely lost out the learning curve that they would have gained if they were going to school every day and out there in public. And
Yeah, learning it's interesting because I went to an all boys school for a long time, and I remember when I came out of that, I didn't go the full trajectory to 18. I came out at 16 and went transitioned to an early college where there were girls, and I didn't know how to talk to this alien species because I just had not been exposed to them at all. it resolved itself over time, but it wasn't disrupted by something like COVID. I think that the inability to actually physically meet and talk to each other meant something rather cataclysmic for our generation. And it seems though that it's not that girls haven't come out of it with mental health problems, but it does seem that the boys seem to be more impacted by it. And I wonder why that is. Is it because young males need biologically, seem to need biologically, to go out and sort of have these adventures together, these physical adventures together? Some people do it through sport and like heavy contact sports, or some people do it through
Right.
going hunting, or some people do it through, we're all skateboarding at the park, and some people do it through this and some people do it through that. I think that young men in particular need risk. They need risk like they need oxygen.
Mhm.
Because, again, having lived with hunters and gatherers, what one observes is that hunting and gathering roles are not completely gender assigned, but they're largely gender assigned just purely by convenience, in that, let's say you have a baby at hip, you're not going to, or you're pregnant, you're not going to run down an antelope at that point. You
Mhm.
might do it as a young girl before you got pregnant, but gender, and then of course, when you go out gathering for wild foods, which ends up being a predominantly female thing, it doesn't mean you're never hunting. And interestingly, as a male, you're also gathering as you hunt and noticing where the wild foods are, and you're going to report that back, and so there is crossover. However, there are a certain amount of gender roles, and young men know that they're going to have to face animals to hunt that will hunt them back. That's the crucial thing. So I've observed this. When you go and you hunt, it's not lions, you're not hunting lions, but you might have to go chase lions off a kill.
Mhm.
And the lion will have something to say about that. And you will encounter antelope like gemsbok or bushbuck. There are these particular types of antelope that are known that they once they figure out that you're hunting them, they'll turn around and hunt you back. And they've got a pretty strong likelihood of getting you. And you need to know how to lean into that risk, etc. So it seems that over however many hundreds of thousands of years, young boys need risk taking. And it's interesting that you were talking at the early part of this conversation about elevated risk taking as a mental health deficit. But one thing I know is that risk taking is necessary as well, but it's supposed to be done under mentorship. You're supposed to
Mhm.
go out with the older hunters, just as you go out with the older gatherers and say, no, not that mushroom, but that mushroom. That mushroom there's going to kill the entire family. That, even though it looks similar to that mushroom there, you need that one. Similarly with the hunting, you don't just blindly go in and take these risks, but there will be a point where you will have to do it
Yeah.
solo. And so you're going to get there gradually. And this involves, of course, tribe. This involves community. This involves actual people showing you what to do and actual risk in a natural environment. So the boys at the skate park who are risking breaking their legs as they're skating down, the courthouse steps, are
Mhm.
fulfilling a biological need, and they shouldn't be chased off.
Right.
They're actually doing it quite creatively because they're harming no one but themselves. It's why young men also go out and get into fights. It's all of this stuff. It doesn't need to be antisocial, but whether you think it should be there or shouldn't be there, it's there. And
Yeah.
that's why the video games present as they do and all of that. So in the absence of that, what how do you help people? So for example, in my work, you know, so much of what I do is reconnecting people with nature.
Mhm.
And saying, before we have any discussion over your endocrine system, which is producing the moods that you've got, we need to be in an environment that's working for us, not against us. And I remember this when I was going through talk therapy and it wasn't really working for me. I remember asking the therapist, I can see the woods outside
Yeah. Yeah.
window. I know something about neuroscience. Please, can we not be in this I'm sitting here, you're sitting there thing
Right.
where I'm feeling I'm itching to get out of my skin and I'm feeling a bit shamed anyway. And can we not go out there and walk under the trees? It will go better if we do.
Sure.
And I
Sure.
couldn't get this guy to do it. And finally I said, I'll pay you double. I'll pay you. I'll pay you for an extra hour for the 10 minutes it takes us to walk out there and the 10 minutes
Yeah.
it takes us to walk back.
Yeah.
And where I think he was uncomfortable with it is I think it actually affected the power balance that he rather liked, that this can happen in therapy, that the therapist has a certain power. And it became a little bit more collegial. So I couldn't really persuade him to keep going, but I know I got more out of the few sessions I managed to
Sure.
bully him to go outside.
Mm.
If you made it this far into the podcast, then I'm guessing you're somebody that, like me, loves to read books about not just how people have achieved self-actualization, but particularly about the relationship with nature, spirituality, life, the universe, and everything. And I'd like to draw your attention to my books. If you would like to read the story of how we even arrived here, perhaps you'd like to check out the 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Horseboy and The Long Ride Home, and come on an adventure with us and see what engendered, what started Live Free, Ride Free. And before we go back to the podcast, also check out The Healing Land, which tells the story of my years spent in the Kalahari with the Sun, Bushmen, hunter-gatherer people there, and all that they taught me and mentored me in and all that I learned. Come on that adventure with me. So talk to me about this, because, you know as well as I do that, yes, males kind of need this.
Yeah.
Don't get it. It then turns weird.
Yeah.
You're now in a therapy situation. What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me start by saying this, because I agree with what you're saying. I think that we need to provide male affirming spaces where boys and men can talk while doing.
Yeah.
And I think that in a traditional therapy practice that is often hard to do. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have an office that's next to a nature preserve or hiking trail or something like that, I think that's great. And I think that as an attorney, there was definitely a hierarchy and a balance of power between the attorney and the client. And when I left that and got into therapy, I got into therapy with the mindset that I'm doing away with that. There's no longer going to be a balance of power. It's just me and this person who's come to me with a particular issue that wants to work on that. And I don't know any more about that issue that he's struggling with than he does. So I need to be in the room and present and acknowledge that we're on this journey together. There's without going into all of the different modalities that I was taught in school or that I picked up after getting out of school that I practice with. I like to use skill-based therapies where there's some engagement with the client. I've always thought I have an interest in weightlifting, and I always thought I would love to have my own gym and have a therapy for men that like that kind of thing, because I think that's what you're talking about. You're engaged.
Yeah, why not do that? Why not do that?
Yeah.
I know, for example, you're also a boxer.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not introduce that into a therapy session?
Yeah. Well, for me right now, the problem is just having the facilities to do that. Now, again, that's something that I think would be great, and I'd like to do that, and perhaps at some point would be able to do that. But I think it is important that you explore those things with the client. That's part of getting to know the client in the very beginning is, what is this client all about? What do they enjoy? What do they like to do? Unfortunately, therapists see a lot of clients that are just so disengaged with the world that they don't know what their interests are. And so a
Yeah.
lot of what we do is try to explore that. What are your values? What are your goals in life? Where do you want to be in 5 years? And to get some idea of who that person is. But I hear what you're saying, and I think it is important. And I would
There's
never.
there's been some interesting science come out of it lately. As you know, I do a lot of work with equine,
Mhm,
and a recent study got published, which is to do with domestic violence and perpetrators of domestic violence, by the
mhm,
way, both male and female. And the results showed that after a 5 week intervention, it was once a week, I think, this is through the University of Bournemouth in the UK, there was a 51% decrease in re-offending
mhm.
a year after finishing that short intervention. And that most of the people who had attended that equine thing had dropped out of talk therapy because they just didn't want to do it.
Wow.
And what they found was that not only did the horses provide all these interesting metaphors and there was nature going on, but that the relationship that the people formed with the horse made them want to come back. But they couldn't really empathize with the therapist. So the therapist could get out of the way and they could form a relationship with the horse. So he actually wanted to come back and spend time with his horse.
Yeah.
And so therefore they finished the program. Because as you know, a lot of people in programs drop out. And I wonder about this. We had recently here on the farm where I'm living, a friend of mine brought her son who was not coming out of the room. And we were lucky we had 3 weeks. And I said, just bring him because the way of life here, I think, will begin to sort it out because there's no heating in this house. And if you want to be warm and it's winter now, you have to cut wood and you have to make a fire. There is just no alternative. There are no radiators. It's a 500-year-old house and it has never had heating.
Mhm.
And to get the wood, we have to go up on the mountain and we have to cut it. And we're not doing it in a kind of a depressed, oh shit, this is terrible sort of a way. We're
Right.
having a bit of a laugh while we do it. But if we don't do it, we won't get warm. And that's before you look at the other things that we do on the farm, that there is just this bottom line. And it was very interesting. We left him alone a bit at first. And then he came out of the room saying, I'm bored. And we said, great, let's go do something then. Or you can go back to your room if you want. We won't force
Be
you.
bored.
I
Yeah.
don't want to go back to the room because I'm cold. Fantastic. I have a solution. We were just about to go up the mountain to get some wood. I don't really want to do that. Okay, fine, no worries. You don't need to do that. We'll go up there and we'll bring some down, but we'll see you in an hour. So, of course, that happened. And then the next time he came up the mountain, and then before you know it, he was up there chopping wood. And what was interesting is that when he went home, he then became more and more engaged in what was going on and then went out and exploring. He's now gone back to his suburban context where he doesn't have those resources available to him outside the front door. So he said to his mum, oh, but don't worry, if I fall back in, I'll always go back. I can go back to that farm and reset.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is because you know the value of these things, yeah, and you now have this new career in front of you. Are you looking at partnering with nature-based things and equine things and that sort of thing and sports-based things?
Sure. Sure.
And
Yeah.
and
To the extent those are out there and I can find those, I think those are something that I would like to integrate into my practice.
mm,
I think programs that combine mental health support and mentoring and coaching and vocational identity and other activities are very important for men. I think they have a very good chance of higher engagement
mm,
with men especially. And obviously, as I go forward and build a practice with that focus, that's going to be important to look out there for that.
Mm. The kids that were coming to you in that internship that you did at the university,
Mm-hmm.
how many of them had parents who'd gone through bad divorces?
There were several. There were
Yeah.
several. I couldn't say it was a majority, but there were several.
Did you notice a pattern there? Were there patterns of certain types of behavior or emotional state that you could say,
Yeah.
yeah, that
Not that we're significantly different from those whose parents were still married.
okay,
Now, again, I don't know, you're when you deal with young people, it is sometimes difficult to get them to give you all of the information that you
indeed,
would like to have. So I
indeed,
don't know how many of those people whose parents were still together could describe their parents' relationship as being a good one or
right,
not. Yeah, you can ask those questions, and a lot of time they say things like, "Yeah, they're fine."
yeah,
That doesn't give me a lot to work with, but that's just the nature of
yeah,
dealing with somebody whose frontal cortex isn't fully developed.
yeah.
Uh, and that's
Talk to us about that actually, because not everybody knows that neuroscience.
yeah,
So, talk to us about the development of the frontal cortex versus the
yeah,
limbic system and why
yeah.
this matters. Yeah.
Well, the frontal cortex doesn't fully develop in humans until they're in their mid to late 20s.
And what does the
Uh,
frontal cortex do?
that is the higher level of thought. That's where your higher level of thought comes from, and your rational thought comes from.
Figuring shit out.
Figuring shit out. The limbic system is that part that what I call the reptilian brain that is involved in the fight or flight. When you're
Right.
faced with something terrible, you either shut down, you explode and fight, or you run off. So for young people, they're not operating on all cylinders, so to speak, when they're faced with a crisis, and they're not able to really think through rationally what their options are and how they're going to solve whatever the issue is.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And this is obviously something in our work we look at all the time that, yeah, it's a little bit like in adolescence, your nose gets a bit big and then another part of you gets a bit big and then the rest catches up. And it's
Right,
exactly the same in the brain. And when the limbic system is ahead of the CEO of the brain, the frontal cortex, things get funky and people get overreactive and self-absorbed. And then we are hard on young people for this, but actually it's exactly how nature has designed it. They have no more choice in the matter
right,
than a toddler does.
right,
She's going through actually a similar type of thing. And as you say, it doesn't resolve itself until the mid late 20s. So that thing of figuring shit out and handling your shit, emotional regulation, you can't do that actually when your limbic system is overtaken in the race. But now some people seem to stay there though. One meets quite a lot of 56-year-olds who are still mentally and emotionally where they were at 12 to 15. What do you think is going on there? Because you see those clients. Those are the clients that were
yeah,
not listening to you as a
yeah,
lawyer.
yeah. It's really, I don't know that I can say that the development hasn't happened so much as sometimes the limbic system just kind of overwhelms the frontal cortex, and they get so overwhelmed with what's going on around them that it kind of goes offline.
What is your strategy for helping them get it back online?
Well, we do a lot of emotional regulation.
How?
A lot of times people come into the office and they're just so dysregulated. We have to do some breathing exercises to begin with, or we have some other exercises that I use to help, some tapping, self-tapping exercises, that come out of the EMDR area that
Tell us
help
about
people.
tapping. Why does tapping work?
Bilateral tapping allows people to, not really sure how it works, but it
Mm.
allows people to regulate their emotions in the moment and to bring themselves back to a more state of stasis and calm in it's worked. It's worked for a lot of my clients.
And it's a guided process,
And
right?
it's a guided process. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just take a minute or two. Guide me through one. Take me through a
Okay.
tap.
Well, I actually happen to have one right here that I used with a client this morning. And so we start with identifying whatever the issue is that is causing the distress, and we name it. You name that in the room. I'm having severe anxiety because I failed a test.
Okay.
And then you rate the intensity of your anxiety on a 1 to 10 scale. And then with the tapping, you can just start by one easy one is just tapping the top of your head and repeating a little mantra that even though I feel or think or have anxiety over this test, I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
And even though I'm having anxiety over this test, I deeply love, forgive, and appreciate myself.
Yes. And then you move down to your temples and repeat the same thing. Even though I feel or think or have anxiety over this test,
Even though I think or
deeply-
feel or have anxiety over this test,
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
Move to your forehead. Same thing. Even though I feel, think, or have anxiety over this test,
Even though I think, feel, or have anxiety over this test,
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
And then we move down to right under your eyes and you do the same thing. Even though I feel, think, or have anxiety over this
feel,
test,
think, or have anxiety over this test,
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
Then right under your nose. Even though I feel, think, or have anxiety over this test,
Even though I think, feel, or have anxiety over this test,
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
And then under your mouth on your chin. Even though I feel, think, or have anxiety over
think,
this
or have
test,
anxiety over this test,
I deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept
I
myself.
deeply and completely love, forgive, and accept myself.
And if the person isn't fully regulated, we'll go through that again.
It does feel better.
Yeah.
I would argue that there's, a creation of endorphins there and what's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, creating of new neurons, novel movement, new pathways. But I can definitely feel a difference. And, I do know people that do this, but I haven't actually done one of those for a while. And I have done them in times of high anxiety, and they really do work. Do you find that men resist this stuff? Or
Yes. Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Yeah. You got to get past that touchy-feely kind of mentality.
How do you get past it?
Well, a lot of times I say, hey, I do this. I do this. I used to do this before I'd go to trial.
Right.
I'd be so overwhelmed with anxiety going into the courtroom that I would find a space someplace and I would do that.
Did you get overwhelmed with anxiety going into the courtroom?
I did.
Yeah.
I would tell, same thing I would tell my clients. I would tell any lawyer, any young lawyer, if you don't get nervous or if you're not nervous when we're walking into the courtroom, I'm really concerned. Okay. That's an instance where anxiety is probably helpful.
Okay.
Now, you don't want to be so anxious that you can't answer a question, or you can't, as a lawyer, you can't ask a question, but I would do that to relax myself before I would start a trial.
This actually could be quite healthy to people listening. healthy anxiety. We're generally told that anxiety is unhealthy. What is healthy anxiety?
Yeah, I don't believe that all anxiety is unhealthy. And look, we evolved with anxiety, and
Mm.
anxiety serves a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Using your metaphor of hunter-gatherers out on the field, if you're anxious, you're hyper aware of what's going on around you. And there's a protective aspect to that. If you're in a bad situation and you're anxious and you're hyper aware of what's happening, if you are faced with an emergency, you're not going to get stuck in some fight, flight, or freeze mode. You're going to be able to think about how I'm going to get out of that.
Mm. So yeah, healthy anxiety allows strategizing.
Right.
But if you have unhealthy anxiety, something like this
It
EMDR,
overwhelms you. It
yeah,
overwhelms you, and you can't think and you can't figure out what you need to do.
it is interesting. I was going through a really anxious period, and I know someone who does EMDR, and I said, "Hit me. Let's see if this works." Which was a slightly different, it's a slightly different one where you're
Right.
doing bilateral stuff with your eyes. And it took my anxiety about this particular thing from a 10 to a 2 in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked at the simplicity of it, actually,
Yeah.
and reassured. I know that you need to wrap this up shortly, that it's the middle of your working day and you have a client that you need to go and see. Do you have any closing advice for men, young or old, or fathers, and people, men going through conflict, whether it's internal or external?
Yeah.
Leave us with your elder advice. What to do?
Well,
What to do?
I would say this, when we look at the things that actually help men, there are things like learning how to normalize emotions without forcing verbal vulnerability. That's difficult for a lot of men.
How does one tread that line, though? Because how do you not become emotionally vulnerable when you?
Well, that they may at some point, but when you're working with men, your role is just to normalize whatever emotions they're feeling,
Okay,
and without trying to force them into
I
a
see.
vulnerable position. Focus on function, goals, and relief rather than feelings talk initially when you're with them. As you pointed out, sometimes talk therapy just doesn't work the
Right.
way it
And
should.
it's interesting too, I think, as a bloke, I definitely like to be focused on solutions and strategizing solutions.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Allow parallel processing. This is the talking while doing
Yeah.
that we talked about. I think that's real important. Reduce the shame by validating effort, not the weakness, by not talking about the weakness, but validating somebody's effort. And gosh, you showed up today. I'm really glad to see you. Good thing, that sort of thing. And then frame help as skill building, not necessarily pathology.
Okay.
You're here to learn how to cope. I want to help you. I want to give you the skills that you can use to help you cope with this situation, rather than saying, well, you're depressed and we need to figure out how to treat the depression.
Okay. Yeah. All of those resonate with me.
Yeah. Men don't need less empathy. They often need empathy delivered differently.
Mm. Yeah. I guess we're all a bit autistic. We learn differently. It's so true. And because even though, yeah, psychotherapy, that whole field started with men, Freud, Jung, as you say, it's become a largely female dominated field. And perhaps the approaches need to be modified for our gender. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a work in progress.
absolutely. Well, I look forward to seeing how it develops. Eric,
I'll
thank you
keep you
so much.
posted.
This has
You
been
bet.
extremely insightful.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I shall see you in Austin, Texas.
I will see you in April in Austin.
Now, before you go, just the plugs. How do people contact you? How do they find you?
www.robertsonct.com. It's my website.
robertsonct.com.
Yes.
Okay.
As in Robertson Counseling and Therapy.
Okay. And if people want to reach out for you as a client, but also for mentorship, all of that stuff, do you offer trainings of any kind? Do you offer workshops?
I don't, but I'm actually, with encouragement from somebody that I've been talking with over the last couple of months, thinking about writing a book on divorce coaching oriented both towards clients and towards people that want to do it.
I would encourage you to write that book. Yeah, absolutely. I would also encourage you to create some workshops and retreats around this.
Yeah.
I think there's a massive need. And I think that the outcomes for families and the kids involved and all of that could be very positively impacted by what you're doing. So
Well,
thank you.
perhaps I'll start a podcast.
Hey, great idea. Get it
All
out.
right.
Okay, my friend.
Thank you,
I will see
Rupert.
you soon. Bye-bye.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com, it's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.